All right, well, we must have an important guest because the crowd actually hushed on its own, which I have almost never seen. When I was young in New Jersey, my mother was Italian, and when we would try to leave Thanksgiving, it would probably take about an hour to get from when we were leaving out through the door. And I just had some flashbacks of trying to get the ambassador from that table over to this chair, which probably took us about 45 minutes because everyone is so excited to have him here and to commemorate his legacy and his connection to the college. So I am Carl Lejwe. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I've been at KU for about 20 months. I have a few more months where I can count it as months, then I guess I have to go by years. And I have the privilege of representing one of the most diverse and really outstanding liberal arts and science colleges in the United States. We range all the way, I like to say, from dance to physics, and do a lot of really amazing things in between. And one of those links to international relations and understanding culture and the larger world around us. And that's, I think, a really nice backdrop for tonight. And I remember when we were thinking about who we would want to approach for the distinguished alumnus event, we were really nervous when we stumbled on one particular name because we'd never called an ambassador before. And we didn't. Has anyone ever said no? We didn't know what would happen. And so Christy Henderson, where's Christy? So she's, I like to call her my boss, but she's our communications person. And we were on the phone, and Ambassador Lewis was so amazingly just endearing and thoughtful and kind, and we just had this moment of like, could this really be the same person who has accomplished so many things and has been such an important part of our foreign policy and just who we are as Americans, that he's just so excited that we would be calling him, that the dean of the college would call him and want to honor him. And it was one of those great kind of Kansas humble moments for me of why our people are so great here. And we do amazing things, but we're even better people. And so I am just really thrilled to have the chance to honor Ambassador Delano Lewis tonight. I'd like us all to just give him a quick round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And we have some special guests here tonight. Gail Lewis. Gail, where are you? Right here. Oh my God, you're right in front of me. We had dinner last night too. We had just dinner tonight, So thank you for being here. You've been married 60 years.
57.
57, okay. Well, and it was amazing to watch the two of you interact last night. The way you would kind of go at each other a little. And then be real tender. It was really nice, actually. So I really appreciated that. You're also a Jayhawk alum, proud one, and amazing dinner companion. So let's give a round of applause. And our college advisory board is here for our meeting, and so we were smart enough to combine those. And so we're actually having a really exciting meeting tomorrow as I actually learn how to have an advisory board. You don't actually come into the dean's job as a professor knowing how to do all these things. And so it's a really exciting time now as we're really trying to build momentum for our students and student experience and supporting our faculty research and really kind of building a diverse and inclusive and amazing KU. And so I really appreciate their being here. Hopefully you'll get a chance to meet some of them tonight. So let me just, before we start our interview, I just want to talk a little bit about the ambassador. He's not a shy person. He doesn't back away from challenges. He's worked in federal government, worked in corporations, from Washington, D.C. to Nigeria to Uganda. I have to take a deep breath before I say all these highlights. U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, lawyer in the Justice Department and the EEOC, Peace Corps Associate Director and Country Director for Nigeria and Uganda. I I wish you had done a little less because it's going to tire me out. On several corporate boards from BET to Colgate-Palmolive, leadership positions at New Mexico State University, what we can call a full-time job at the Menninger Clinic when he was a law student. That was actually one of the first things we bonded over. I'm a clinical psychologist. He gives back, philanthropist, author, motivational speaker. Speaking of that, his book is on sale in the back, and I think they can get a signed copy, right?
I think maybe.
All right, so we'll work on that for you. So I am so pleased to honor Ambassador Lewis tonight and to hear more about his experiences and to share that with you all. I've prepared a few questions. I'll go through those with the ambassador, and if we have some time, we can take a few questions from the audience, and then we can present our award. So are we ready?
Thank you.
Right. So let's start off with a bit of nostalgia. Can you tell us your favorite memory from a time at KU, and how has Lawrence changed from when you were in school?
But before I answer that, could I say a word or two?
It's your
Before I answer
event.
the question? First of all, thanks for coming. This is so special. Sitting on the front row here are family members and a cousin that I haven't seen in years, Karen from Wichita, her granddaughter, she said, shh, her granddaughter. And it's so great to see her. Her mother and my mother were sisters, and I haven't seen her in a long time, so it's so great to have her here. Before I started dating Gail, I knew a lot of her cousins before I met Gail, because she was from Topeka, but family in Kansas City. And so sitting on the front row is her cousin, Herman Jones, and he's named Herman Jones II for Gail's father, Herman T. Jones. And he's the sheriff of Shawnee County. And I couldn't be more proud of my cousin. And his sons, his wife, Carlene, and she should come first because she's the power behind the sheriff. Carlene is an educator and been involved with the school systems in Topeka and other places. And her two sons, Daniel and Philip, and Philip's wife, and Paige, and then they have a grandson and a child. And Daniel is here, and Daniel's friend Alexa. So the family is here. But then there's so many. See, you got a response. But I'm going to answer your question. But then there are people here from KU that I've known. There is the dean of the Washburn Law School and his wife, Melissa, John Concannon. I mean, just people that shared my life. And then there's the NPR side with Ron Jones of KCUR and my public radio side. And I was out at the Hills today, and there was a former president of Hills that's here, and there's several employees of Hills Pet Nutrition. And so I know I'm missing folks, but there's so many people here, and I just want to say thank you. My fond memories and nostalgia. I'd have to say the fondest memory is the first date. The first date. I'd met this woman in '56, but we didn't really start dating till '58, and I did not have a date for the Alpha Kappa Alpha dance. So my roommate said to me, "Who are you taking to the dance?" I said, "I don't have a date." He said, "Why don't you ask Gail Jones?" I said, "Gail who?" He said, "Gail Jones." I said, no, she's much too smart for me. No. So I did ask Gail, and she said yes. And I sent our kids a picture today. We have 4 sons and 11 grandchildren. And I sent the sons the picture, because we took a picture out in front of the Union next to the Jayhawk. And I sent it to the sons, and I said, this is where it all began. 59 years ago is when we had the date. So that's one of the first memories of this place. The place has changed. KU meant so much to me personally. When I left Oriot Hall and went over to, I had this is the old Army barracks, if those remember Oriot Hall, and I was in a dorm, and I hated every minute of it. And when the fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha came calling, I went to the frat house in 1014 Mississippi and stayed 3.5 years in the frat house. And so that, to me, is a very warm, warm memory of being initiated into the fraternity, and in 1960, 59 and 60, being president of the chapter. So those were really warm memories. And finally, I was involved in a lot of activities. I was a part of the Rock Chalk Review, which was a group of people who did acts, and I was a tap dancer. My roommate, Reginald Buckner, was the pianist, and we were a part of the Rock Chalk Review. We went around to several other Big 8 schools with our act representing Kansas. So I have a great number of memories of this place. And it has grown and changed. I mean, obviously all the growth on the West Campus, but it still has this warm, very sincere feelings for us. And lastly, I'm still trying to work on getting someone here. None of the 4 boys came here. I'm now working on the grandkids, and there are 2 now that I've got my sights set on. So.
Well, you have a partner in that.
All right.
We'll work on them together. So you were a double major in history and political science. So when you think about these liberal arts and science skills and values, what does that mean to you, and what are the times where maybe that's in unexpected ways been a real asset in your career?
Well, I say all the time the value of liberal arts education cannot be underestimated. I was asking Christy, she said, we're going to have dinner with the advisory board. And so I said to her last night, would you send me the link? You can do so much with technology. Will you send me the bios of the advisory board before I have dinner with them tonight? And so she sent me the bios. And I ran through the bios, and it's amazing how many of the advisory board to your college are liberal arts graduates. And they're not only just liberal arts graduates, they are political science and history graduates, which I was very impressed by. So I think that for me, that kind of liberal education, a broad education, gives you the kind of background to do so many things. Whether it's in literature and the arts and culture, or whether it is in dance or the creative arts, or whether it's in languages or history, all those things, I think, give you the breadth of education. So it gives you a sense of others. And that put me in good stead from my Peace Corps days in Nigeria and Uganda, and obviously from my time as ambassador to South Africa. That underpinning of understanding people, understanding cultures, respecting others was a very important part of my success.
So that actually ties into the next question, which is your career experiences have been so diverse. What has that been like going from public service to the corporate world to what you had done in terms of helping others? How has that been switching from those, and what do you feel like has been important in helping you do that?
Oh, it's so funny you should ask. I was raised in Kansas City, Kansas, and had an only child, and mother was a high school graduate from our Kansas City, Kansas. My father only finished 11th grade, but he went on to be a porter on the Santa Fe Railroad for 37 years. And, you know, they gave me everything they could, and obviously education was important. And as I was going through my career and moving around and shifting in these various jobs, I would call my dad and say, Dad, I just want to let you know, and Mom, but I talked to my dad, I just let you know that he said, what happened to the last job? He didn't quite understand all this moving around. So I would just call and let him know. But it to me was seizing the opportunities that were presented to me over time, and I was very blessed to have a good, solid education at KU and have a wonderful foundation in law at Washburn. So I have 2, obviously, places that I embrace. KU gave me that foundation, and Washburn was very special to us in terms of my legal career. And I moved into government service, and what happened is I always wanted to be in civil rights. And so when I got to Justice Department, I had no idea where I was going and what division. I ended up in criminal division, and we were chasing communists and spies. And so I wasn't sure that's what I wanted to do most of my life. So I finally figured out how to move out and got to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was dealing with employment discrimination. And then all of a sudden, I've got this opportunity to expand my life by going to the Peace Corps. And so to answer your question, it was taking advantage of those opportunities. With Gail's advice, we talked about this a lot, and expanding our horizons. And I'll just tell you one quick story. I really wanted to stay in the country. I wanted to do law. I wanted to do civil rights. And EEOC was great. But then this Peace Corps thing came along, and I had thought maybe I could come back. There was a position open at the Civil Rights Commission in Missouri at Jefferson City, and I could come. I said, that could bring us back to Midwest, and maybe I could get close to Kansas and maybe run for office. I had all these thoughts. And I came home to talk to Gail, and we had been talking to the Peace Corps, and she looked at me and she said, Jefferson City and Nigeria? She said, is there a choice here? So I hope there's no one here from Jefferson City, but anyway, we went on, and we kept expanding those kinds of opportunities and choices, and came back and worked in the business world and National Public Radio. And so we've navigated those things and made them work to our advantage. And so I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about your family a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about kind of some of the values and what you learned from your parents and how you've kind of taken that with you now?
Very, very important question about family. When you read the book, I talk a lot about family and about relationships. The reason why I was so excited about Karen being here, Karen and I both share on our mother's side. My mother had 9 sisters and 2 brothers, and Karen's mother was next to the baby, and my mother was the 3rd from the bottom. But being an only child, my father being away, I spent a lot of time with my mother. And she was an extraordinary woman. And so only a high school education, but she believed in literature. She believed in the arts, and she was just incredible. And she encouraged me to read, and she expanded my horizons. I'll never forget the story. She said, I want you to go, we're going to go up to Minnesota Avenue, and we're going to sit down. I said, Mom, I don't want to go up there. It's segregated. It's the black part of the counter there. I don't want to do that. She said, well, we're going to do it anyway because I want to teach you how to eat and when you go out and what fork to use. And so we're going to do this. I played violin. I played trumpet. I was a drum major. I was a tap dancer. A lot of those things came from my mother. And the whole thing about service came from home. And then my father was the breadwinner, and I can remember watching him being proud to go to work. I remember him in his uniform, his shoes shined, very proud to be a porter for the Santa Fe for 37 years. Incredible person. So family was very, very important. The church was important. I was a part of the H Street Baptist Church, which the Jones family was also a part of. The neighborhood was very important. So the family provided me the value system which I carry on today. So it was extremely important.
So you've had so many successes. And one thing I've really noticed with our students is when they hear about someone like you and all the great successes and great things that happen, they don't always know the failures along the way and the resilience and the grit that allows one to kind of work through those failures and become a better person. Could you just talk a little bit about one of those times where something didn't go as you had hoped and out of it you really became a better person?
Yeah, I was talking to the Hills group this afternoon, and Hills Pet Nutrition, and the similar question came up, and I said, I really don't like to talk about failures. I really don't, but they are important, and they're learning experiences. The first one that comes to mind, and there have been a number, the first one comes to mind is Gail and I married after we left KU in 1960, and we went to Washburn. We stayed in married student housing on the campus, and we had Delano Jr. the first year. We had Jeffrey the 3rd year. He was born the day before I took the Kansas bar. We thought about calling him Justice instead of Jeffrey, but we didn't. I remember, what am I going to do? I had this great job at the Miniger Foundation. I was a child care worker at the Miniger Foundation for those years that I worked. I worked 40 hours a week and went to law school full time. The Minigers were an incredible institution. As a child care worker, I learned more about people. I was taking care of middle-sized boys, 8 to 14, and I learned more about people as being a very important part of the treatment process of the Miniger Clinic. And it was a very important part of my life. So here I'm now graduating, and what was I going to do? Where was I? So I said, you know, one thing that I could do is to practice in the military. And so I thought about the Judge Advocate Corps. So I went out to Forbes Air Force Base, which was outside Topeka no longer, but Forbes was an active base, and I went out there for my physical exam. And I never forget, I had everything off with my skivvies, and the doctor came behind me, and I could see him behind me for this physical, and he stopped. And I said, oh my God, what's up? And he stopped again. And I stopped. So anyway, he said he found a heart murmur. And I never knew I had a heart murmur. It was really quite something. I went back to talk to my mother, and she said, well, I don't know. You had asthma as a baby, but I'm not really sure. But anyway, I wasn't going to fly, but it was enough to keep me out of Judge Advocate. A really big disappointment. One of the things I talk about, and I'll tell you this story quickly, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was up on a rooftop restaurant bar, and this young man came up and he said, are you Delano Lewis? And I said, yes. He said, I'm a Washburn Law graduate. And he said, I heard you speak at the law school. And he said, I finished law school, I went on to the Judge Advocate Corps, and I came back, and I'm working at a law firm in Washington. And I remember what you said at law school when I was a student. You said, you know, you need to plan. He said, but life is learning how to deal with plan B because plan A never works. And he said, I remember that to this day. And so my plan A, the Judge Advocate, didn't work. And I had to think about plan B. And plan B happened, I'll tell you quickly about plan B. Plan B happened because it's also part of my book about relationships and people along the way. The book talks about self and having self-confidence, but I didn't do it alone. I had a partner, number one. I had a strong family foundation. I did not do it alone. But Plan B came about because of my next-door neighbor at Washburn Law. Sue Coe was helping her husband, Dave Coe, through undergraduate school, and he was pre-med. And they were our next-door neighbors. And he graduated, and he went on here to KU Medical School to become a doctor. Well, she worked in the U.S. Attorney's office in Topeka. And so when he transferred to Kansas City, she went to work for the U.S. Attorney in Kansas City. His name was Newell George. And Newell George was a congressman from Kansas City who lost his bid in 1960 for re-election. And John F. Kay appointed him U.S. Attorney for the state of Kansas. Well, Sue was his assistant. So she wrote me a letter. And she said, Delano, you need to apply for the honors program of the Department of Justice. And I said, Sue, you know I'm not an honor student. I'm doing okay. I'm working 40 hours a week, but I'm not an honor student. She said, you should apply anyway. So I applied. And Newell George called and said, come up for an interview. And I never forget walking into his office, and there was these pictures. He said, let me show you around. Here's a picture of JFK in a hat. You've probably never seen this before. Here's a picture of Bobby and his family. He was a very close Kennedy friend. We sat down, we had this great discussion. Next thing I know, Sue sent me a letter that Newell George sent to the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. He said, Dear Bobby, I wish you could meet this young man. He's done very well in law school. He probably would be an honor student if he hadn't supported his wife and worked 40 hours a week. And the next several months later, I got a call saying, Mr. Lewis, we're considering you for an appointment at the Department of Justice. Relationships, being ready to take advantage of those. That was Plan B. And I went to Washington as an attorney for the Department of Justice when Bobby Kennedy was the AG. Not bad, huh?
You know, I only ask that question to really successful people. Otherwise, it's sad. You know.
I have a few more failures I can tell you about.
Wow. So, one last question before we open it up. Your memoir has so many important lessons in it. We don't want to stop anyone from buying the book, but What's one that would be an important take-home message for the audience tonight?
The take-home message, let me tell you why I decided to write the book. Gail has written several books. She's written a book about raising a family in Nigeria called Letters from Nigeria. And wonderful story because she always keeps journals, and she's keeping notes. She's been keeping notes from the time I think we were dating. I've said to many people, I'm not going to divorce court because Gail's got all the evidence. She's been keeping notes for a long time. So she wrote her family and she said, I've got these 3 little boys and we're in Nigeria and I'm not going to be able to do my journals, but I'm going to write you and would you keep my letters? And so when we moved her mother from Texas to New Mexico in her 90s and we were cleaning out the garage, we found all of these letters that Gail had sent from Nigeria. And so Gail wrote the book, and it's called Letters from Nigeria, and it's about those experiences. And she's written a book about Uganda as well. And so she said, you should write it. And our 3rd son, who went to become a chef, is now a life coach, and he's written several books about his own struggles in life, but also how he's overcome those struggles. And he's written a book. And so between the 2 of them, they said, you've got to write this book. And so they helped me with the book, and they helped me edit it. And it's a very short read, 77 pages. The big takeaway from the book is it's a how-to book. It's how I did it, how I moved from place to place, it's about how to discover your passion, connect with people, and succeed in life. It's not the only way, but it's how I did it. And the big takeaway starts with self. And it starts with an assessment of yourself. Because if you're going to make progress in life, you're going to have an understanding of who you are. And I talk about being a self-assessment, having a sense of who you are. What are those strengths? Obviously, what are those weaknesses? But what are those strengths? And you capitalize on those strengths. And so I move out from the self piece, understanding who you are. The other part of the book is a game plan. And here's where when you got that signal last night between 2 very different people. Gail is one that's spontaneous, and she says, we don't need to plan. And she said, this guy was born with a date book in his hand. And, so we're completely different, on this score. But I believe in the book that you need to have a plan. And I call it a plan of action for what you want to do in life. And I talk about an end game, E-N-D. And the end game is to decide where you want to be 5 or 10 years from now. What is it you really would like to do? What is it you want to be? And once you figure that out, that end game, then work backwards to figure out what are the steps necessary to get there. And that's what I've done in my career. When I decided I wanted to move from X to Y, what is it going to take? And then the other part of the takeaway of the book is you don't do it alone. Once you have that sense of confidence, that self-initiative, that spark, then mentors and relationships are extremely important. I had this solid foundation at home. I had a great partner as I got married and raised a family, but then I had a mentor and mentoring relationships. Now, the jury may be out as to whether you find a mentor or a mentor finds you. I have a feeling that mentors find you. And I'll give you my quick story of my telephone experience. I did not want to be a business person particularly. I was recruited to the telephone company. The telephone company found me on Capitol Hill, Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, largest private employer in the District of Columbia. They've had enough sense to say, home rule is going to come to the district one day. There's going to be an elected mayor. There's going to be an elected city council. There's going to be a regulatory body. Right now, we go to Capitol Hill to deal with business for this company. But one day, we're going to have to be local. And so they sent a guy up on the Hill to say, see if you can find somebody to help the company. So I was working as chief of staff for Delegate Walter Fauntroy. He was the non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives from the District of Columbia. I was his chief of staff. And so one day the legislative assistant came to me and says, have you seen this guy from the telephone company? I said, no. He said, he's pretty high on you. I wouldn't be surprised if he wouldn't call you and ask you to go to lunch. Well, he did. And we went to lunch, and he basically said, our company needs a guy like you with this kind of experience. You know politics, you've been in government, home rule's going to come to the city, and we need somebody that knows the government. So I signed on. And I wasn't really sure about being there. I was in public affairs and regulatory. To make a long story short, after 6 years, I got promoted, and I was the first black officer of Bell Atlantic. And I was reporting directly to the president, to the vice president. And I didn't realize, again, talking about mentors, he saw a lot in me that I didn't particularly see in myself. I should have gotten the picture. When he promoted me to assistant VP, his office, my office was next to his office. I should have gotten the message that he had something in mind by my office being next to his. And so he mentored me for 6 solid years. I began to learn the business in telecom. I was not just the public affairs manager. I was just not the regulatory person dealing with the lawyers. I was beginning to understand how to run a business. And I was quite fortunate to have that mentor called Ralph Frey. Ralph was an extremely humble man. And I only say this because I think it's important to understand it. A white American who believed that this company called Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, which was predominantly with black employees, in a city that was predominantly black, a school system that was 90% black, he felt in those days that the person running the telephone company should be an African American. That was his view. And so talk about diversity, that was his view. And he decided to figure out how to make that happen. And I tell you this story because all of you who are interested in diversity, those who are working in businesses and organizations, if you want to do it, you can do it. Now, what he did was he brought in the first guy who happened to be African American, made him assistant general counsel. When the general counsel retired, Lee Satterfield became the first black general counsel. He brought me in on the public affairs side, promoted me, set my office next to him in public affairs and regulatory, and I became an assistant vice president. He brought another African American from AT&T, who was a finance guy, brought him in, made him assistant controller. When the controller retired, he made him the controller. There were 3 black department heads reporting to Ralph. There were only 10 black department heads in all of AT&T. The largest corporation in the world, only 10 black department heads, 3 of them were in Washington, D.C. That was Ralph. So I want to tell you, the 3 of us were in contention to replace him. Lee Satterfield in particular wanted the job. Ed and I sort of battled for the job, and I was appointed by Ralph to succeed him. And to close this story out, Ralph, I was there and took over Ralph's job when he retired, and then he became very ill, and I'm in South Africa and traveling in the limo in South Africa as ambassador, and my phone rings. And it's Ford Frey, and he said that his dad was very ill, but his dad said to him that if there's anything happens to me, that I want Del Lewis to do my eulogy. And so the next call I got was from Ford and said that Ralph had passed. But before I tell you about that one, I saw him in the hospital. And I was supposed to go over to meet the UN ambassador in Washington, but Ralph was in the hospital. So I called up the UN ambassador and I said, I can't make it, I've got to go see my friend Ralph. So I went in the hospital and Ralph is there, and I walked in the room and he said, Del, he said, if I was a kissing man, I would kiss you. And I said, that's all right, I'll kiss you anyway. So that was the kind of relationship we had. And then when Ford called and said he'd passed, so Gail and I said there was no doubt we would be back. And so we came and I gave a eulogy. And I talked at the eulogy about here's a man who believed in diversity and who made diversity work right there in a telephone company. So I got off your question. But those experiences were important, and the reason I got off on it was mentors and relationships. Ralph was an extremely important mentor. I got many of you in this room that have been mentors that I have learned from, and I value your input. But those relationships are extremely important, but that you don't do it on your own. And I've been very blessed to have those mentors in my life. So thank you.
Great, thanks. So we'll do a few questions. Now, a few ground rules. 1 question. 2, no statements with a question mark at the end. So as long as we follow those 2, we should be all set. So Christy has microphone in the back. Walt, did you want to?
Oh, there's Walt. You can make a statement.
You know, I remember you talking about the special value of going to an all-black high school in Kansas City where you had role models. Can you elaborate on that? And what, I mean, you went to high school before desegregation, and how important that experience was to you.
Thank you. Before I answer your question, that question came from Dr. Walt Miniger, and I'm so pleased to have Dr. Walt here. He also made my day as a very close friend when he called me and said, you know, the hospital is moving from Topeka to Houston. And even before that, he invited me to be on the board of the Miniger Foundation. So a child care worker who then became a board member of Miniger's. And then when they moved to Houston, Dr. Walt called and asked and said, would you be the keynote speaker for our dinner, which will be an inauguration dinner for our movement to Houston. So Dr. Walt, that question you asked is a very important question. Many in the room know that Sumner High School was the only black high school in the state of Kansas, and that it was, superintendent in the Kansas City school system that decided to keep, went to the legislature for a special rule to keep all the schools in Kansas City, Kansas segregated. The elementary schools were segregated, but most high schools across the state were integrated, except Sumner. And Brown v. Board of Education, as you know, is about Linda Brown in Topeka going to get to elementary school. But Sumner had an unbelievable history. Yes, it was a very important part of my life because there were teachers there with masters working on their PhDs, African-American teachers, who, because of segregation and discrimination, could not find jobs in other places. And so they were there at Sumner. And so I had some excellent, excellent teachers. They really, like many teachers in many systems, believed in their students, and they really cared for us. And those of us who had ambitions, they really gave us sort of extra care. And for me, it was the male role models. I had a role model at home. My dad was a role model on many levels. But at Sumner, the African-American men were extraordinary in my judgment. I can tell you now, my band teacher, my chemistry teacher, my biology teacher, the science teacher in 9th grade, they were all University of Kansas people. And all of them had pledged Alpha Phi Alpha and were initiated into Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. So I knew when I was in high school, I was going to Kansas and I was going to be an Alpha Phi Alpha brother. So that was how important it was, Dr. Walt. Then one last story. I lived on the corner of 10th and Freeman. And the house that was right on the corner at 10th Street was the house of my principal, Saul Thompson. And that was a blessing and a curse. I mean, it was a great, a great neighborhood. But every night I would come, not every night, but when I would come back from a date in high school, Mr. Thompson was walking his dog. So one day he came by the band class and he said to Mr. Clark, he said, how's Delano doing? He said, oh, he's dragging his feet a little bit. Yeah, he could be doing better. And Mr. Thompson said, well, he stays out too late. I know what's going on. So that was the kind of environment that I had. My principal was on the corner, the neighborhood I had, the church that I went to, 8th Street was up the street. The school was a very important part of my life. And Sumner still had that kind of reputation, and it's still true today. And it's now Sumner Academy, but in those days it was extremely important to all of us in the community.
Great. Okay. We're going to have to figure out how to handle a limited amount of time and a lot of hands. But so, God, I don't even know. Well, let's get your question up here.
Hi there.
Hi.
So you mentioned that if someone is interested in increasing or working on diversity in an organization, it can be done. And so I was wondering if you can give some tips on how to identify an executive in the organization that would be like your Ralph.
Tough question. I talked about diversity and how could I identify a person in an organization that could be like Ralph. I think that's beginning to happen in many organizations. That Ralph was ahead of his time, and I think there are a number of executives in major companies and around the world, around the country that have that kind of understanding. Diversity will only work if it's valued from the top, and so it has to start from the top. And Bob Wheeler's here from former Hills, which is a subsidiary of Colgate-Palmolive, and I can tell you that at Colgate-Palmolive and Hills, the tone was at the top. And Leslie's here, who's now with Hills. And the tone's at the top. And from Reuben Mark, that was the CEO when I came, and now Ian Cook. And they just don't mouth it. They begin to put people in place. And it becomes a part of the business fabric. It's just not something we say we're gonna put numbers to it. It's something we believe is a part of the business culture. That diversity is a reflection of our consumers. How can we sell products to these consumers when our whole company, our company does not look like the people we serve? You saw that coming, right? That's Gail. There's Gail. So that diversity is a business imperative. It's critical. It makes good business sense, is what I'm saying. That your top leadership throughout the company should reflect your consumer base because it is diverse. So how do you find that person? Maybe if you don't find them, you recruit them. But it's got to start from your board, and it has to start from your top leadership. So I can't give you any more, exact than that. But it has to start from the top. But again, it has to be believed. That maybe you don't believe that it's an imperative, that it makes sense. But if it does, I think it's proven to be workable. Danielle, did I do well on that? You did. Danielle Dempsey-Swope, another relative who reports to the president at Washburn in diversity. So glad you're here. And her daughter.
Okay, so yeah, we probably have time for one more, so let's get one of our board members. So.
Thank you for your wonderful remarks. I'd be interested to know if you had any important learnings from your experience in South Africa.
Important learnings.
Lots of important learnings. I guess the most important learning I can share with you in this amount of time we have is from President Mandela. And I was just blessed to have had that opportunity. He had served 27 years in prison, was released, and if you read his book when de Klerk was trying to make all of this happen to release him, he was busy working on his exit, and when de Klerk said, okay, we're ready to go, Mandela said, no, I'm not ready yet. Can you imagine? 27 years, he said, I'm not ready yet. He had things to do to put in place. And so he stepped out and ran for president and was elected, and there were 5-year terms, and he only stayed 5 years. So he stepped down in 99, and I came to South Africa in 99. His deputy, Thabo Mbeki, succeeded him. I presented my credentials to President Mbeki, and I made a call on President Mandela as well. And I had many other opportunities to interact with President Mandela. And if there's one important learning, and you've seen movies about him, you've read about him, it's very true from the time that you meet him. He is so humble. But what you get from him is that it just wasn't me. He is so humble when you're in his presence. He was a tall man, but he was a giant, and you felt it. But you also felt it wasn't me. He said there were so many others. And the other thing he said, we're all one South Africa. We're all South Africans. That's what he believed. And when I went to talk to him one day, he says, I don't have a lot of time. I'm dealing with the problems in Burundi. He said they've got 16 political parties, and I'm bringing them all to the table. That's what he believed, in inclusiveness. And so the belief in one South Africa, which cut down on the bloodshed and the violence because of his attitude and because of his spirit, an incredible man. But that inclusivity, that coming together, that belief in the oneness in that country. Now, they've got their issues and challenges today, but that was one takeaway from South Africa. A very beautiful country with a lot of challenges, but the leadership from Mandela down has put that foundation there. So that's one takeaway. There are a lot of other learnings that I had as being ambassador. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life. To be an ambassador to any country, to represent the United States to any country is a very high honor. But to be the U.S. representative to the Republic of South Africa was just enormous. To be an ambassador, you have to understand foreign policy. You have to be able to communicate foreign policy. Your job is that you are the messenger. You give the word to the country from America, and then you take the word from that country back. So you have to understand it to be able to articulate it. It was just an incredible experience. So I have a lot of takeaways, and we don't have time to talk about them, but Mandela was the greatest pleasure. One last story about Mandela. I had a quick visit at his office, and Gail was with me. Her sister was there, and I had two grandsons in the car. And so I went in. I said, I'll be a few minutes. And so I went in to see the president, and we were walking out of his office, and he said, how is the family? I said, they're fine. I said, my wife is in the car with my sister-in-law and granny. He said, in the car? He said, bring them in. So my grandsons were what? They were 10 or 11 at that time, 9 or 10. Could you imagine? They came in, and we had tea with the president, and we were sitting there, and he turned to my grandsons, and he said, do you know that your grandfather is a very important man? Nelson Mandela said that I was a very important man. Oh, lots of takeaways.
Did you ask him to write that down? So one thing I've really learned from you is watching the way you interact with Gail. And my wife just looked at me and said, I want to ask a question. So I know we said we were going to stop, but... No, the microphone's coming. You gave me that look. I mean...
He's a smart man. That's why we get along.
My question is, your story is amazing, fantastic, and
Thank you.
a lot of people have the opportunities that you have. You had great family support, great friends, great mentors, good schools. I mean everything, but not really the way you made it. So, what was the inner drive? Something that made you go forward, although I understand how important other thing is, but there should be something more, that's something that adds to that completes the whole picture. So what is that one thing that you can tell young kids out there and young, people out there that they really want to start a new career and give to the society the way you did? So what is it? And they have everything that you talked about.
Right.
But what is that thing that came from you that made you who you are?
Wow. It's a tough one. And I guess I would have to say it came from the value system of home. That what I saw very early on was, from my family situation, service. And so I never forgot it. I mean, my mother was always doing things in the community. Karen would probably remember this. I mean, I think she always wanted a girl because she was always around braiding somebody's hair or fixing somebody. She was always doing things. And I was very fortunate that she didn't have to work outside the home until I went off to junior high. So I spent a lot of time. But it was something about service. It was something about purpose, about giving and serving. And so I think it was at home. And then I married a person who believed in others and doing from others. And she came from a family that did the same. So I think it's in the family.
Great. Well, that's a great ending. And now we have our opportunity to present you your award.
Oh, thank you.
So where are you, Win? So Win Panay is our president of the advisory board. I don't know if we warned you were coming up, but hopefully we did.
I come when called.
Okay. So yeah, we'll come over. We put this here so you couldn't see what it was. And then we'll unveil it, so I'll let you present that.
This whole evening has been so inspiring for me, I'm sure for all of us. Ambassador Lewis, thank you so much for coming back, and please receive the Distinguished Alumni Award from the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Kansas.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Beautiful.
And you should show that Jayhawk.
That's right.
And Dale, you should come up, yes. We have two Jayhawks right there.
Looks good. Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was great. It was great.
Well, that concludes our show tonight, and this has really been a great experience for me. It's a great experience for the college, and I think this was a great opportunity tonight to show who we are and what we're about in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We will continue to do this, and thank you for being a part of setting this trajectory for us.
Well, can I say formally, thank you very much. I turned my mic off. But thank you so much. This has been a wonderful experience. And to thank all of the family and friends and that are here. It's incredible for the Lewises. And so thank you.
I'm going to give you a hug. Thank you.